There we are.
Okay. Amazing. Okay, so we are recording, I believe. Okay, so to start, I just want to thank everyone for coming. There are so many people here, I can't see everyone at once, so I'm really grateful that so many people are showing up. I know that we have a lot of questions and topics that people are eager to learn about. So I'd like to just get right into it. And since it is being recorded, like if people trail in a little late, then that's fine. So yeah, I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name is Marissa. I am a staff writer in Trending News. And though I cover a lot of trans content for the site, I am cisgender, so I am just an ally. So I am also very eager to learn from our panelists today too. So even though I am asking the questions, I definitely do not have all of the answers or consider myself an expert by any means. So, okay, with that, if each panelist, so KB, Holiday, and Leigh, could each quickly introduce yourselves in like a few sentences, and then I will jump into the questions. So Leigh, since you are familiar to many of us here at Daily Kos already, would you like to take the lead?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Hi, folks. It's so good to see so many of you again. My name is Leigh. I use here, they pronouns. I am a queer, transgender, queer, white and native person with disability living in the unceded occupied territories of the Munsee and Lenape tribes in a place called Kingston, New York. I'm a consultant, strategist, and facilitator around diversity, inclusion, and equity. And work with a variety of different organizations, from small two-person grassroots nonprofits to really big behemoths that work globally, and everywhere in between to support their deeper understanding and practice of equity within their work. I'm also a Theater of the Oppressed practitioner and do that work to support organizations, activists, and educators to have deep dialogues around the issues that they experience in community and how they can actually do that in creative ways. And yeah, just been working on LGBT and gender issues for over 20 years now, and excited to be in this dialogue and conversation with my colleagues and with all of you all.
Thank you, Leigh. That was excellent. Holiday, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hey, y'all. I'm Holiday Simmons. My pronouns are he and him. My home is the former Muskogee Creek territories, now known as Atlanta, Georgia. I run a holistic mental health and spiritual wellness practice called Southern Soul Wellness. And we support LGBT folks, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, formerly incarcerated people, and men working on transforming their patriarchy. And so those are the clients we serve. It's a one-on-one practice as well as a group practice. We support social justice and climate justice organizations. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here. But before I went back to my mental health roots, I was an advocate for LGBT folks in the South, as well as LGBT youth before that. And so I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. And so last but not least, KB, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit?
Hello, what's up, everybody? I'm KB. My pronouns are they and them. I am on Comanche, Carrizo, and Comanche People's Land, otherwise known as Austin, Texas. I'm a poet, essayist, and cultural worker. My work entails essentially talking about politics and culture through writing. And also kind of like DEI and accessibility work with individual companies, institutions, and things like that. My roots are in community organizing, and I try to center art-based activism and organizing in all of the things that I do. Thank y'all for having me.
Wonderful, thank you. So to give everyone like a rough outline of how the panel is going to go, like so you can mentally prepare for what topics we're going to hit, I'd like for our panelists to talk to us about pronouns to start. And then I would like us to touch on combating right-wing talking points that people who are moderates or even progressives might slip into, like how to respond to those and how to identify them. And I would love for us to also talk about breaking down myths and like journalistic responsibility when it comes to gender affirming healthcare, particularly for youth. And I would also love if we could talk about combating stereotypes and myths when it comes to trans people of all ages in sports. So those are kind of the big picture topics. And if you guys haven't already seen, there is a link available where you can submit anonymous questions that we can hit in the question and answer portion. So you can feel free to write those in at any time on the Google form. And if it's something that ends up being covered, then we can always review it or skip it, just depending on like what the group wants, but feel free. Or you can also leave questions in the Slack if you prefer, or rather the Zoom chat, it doesn't matter. Okay, but so with that in mind, I'll open this up for each panelist just so that everyone can hear variations on why this is so important. But I would love if we could start with Holiday. Can you share with us why it is so important that people honor everyone's pronouns, even if we don't always understand them, or even if we feel some pushback, say, in terms of grammar or what their pronouns were before, like how to reach people who just aren't quite getting why it's valuable?
Sure. I'm having some access needs. I'm hearing some feedback. I think, I'm sorry to call you out, but Colleen, if you could mute yours, I'm just hearing some feedback. I'm having a hard time hearing. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Yes, absolutely. Pronouns. So a phrase that I heard someone say once that is I've since used for my family and other folks who were having a hard time is pronouns are a big deal for me, but they don't need to be for you. In other words, they make such a big difference, and it's a small thing to shift for someone who's trying to be supportive. And it's sort of the gateway to safety, connection, and understanding. So if you can address if you can use the term that how someone wants to be addressed, that's just the beginning of an opening for better understanding, safety, and connection. There's rooms for mistakes, even as trans people, we make mistakes. Also, people change pronouns. So what's right today might be incorrect the next day. So it's a good practice to ask. It's a good practice to in maybe not every staff meeting, but in some formats, to have everyone say their pronouns, to put them in their signature for their email, just to get into the practice of, we all have, for the most part, pronouns. Some people don't like the standard ones. They only want their name, but whatever it is, we all want to be referred to respectfully. So creating a culture of doing that is helpful for everybody, as not just for people who have a pronoun that you might not expect. It's really to help keep everyone safe. Yeah.
Amazing, thank you. Leigh, I think I saw you nodding along. Would you like to jump in next?
Sure. I mean, I think everything Holiday said is definitely really crucial. And the only other couple things to add is, just remembering that when we ask somebody their name, we're asking like, what word can I call you? And we don't check people's IDs. We don't check like what validation they should for having that name. We just go by what they tell us. But pronouns are usually words that are chosen for us by other people based on their expectation of who we are or who we're supposed to be, based on a cursory look at our bodies. So they take a look at our bodies and they make an expectation and put a word on us. And so that's something that may actually work for you. It's totally great. It's never been an issue for you to have somebody call you by a pronoun that isn't somehow in alignment with what they read upon your body. And for other folks, it's actually not as common, right? That folks take a cursory look at our bodies, they make a decision, and they're communicating that in their words. And so ultimately, when we ask our names, we ask pronouns too, just to say, what are all the words I can use for you, rather than me choosing some. The other thing is just to remember that for a lot of trans people, like using the wrong pronouns can actually be dangerous. Depending on where we are, especially with a lot of anti-trans hate that we are experiencing the uptick of significantly right at this moment, and the legislation that then empowers people to be even more judgmental and caustic in interactions with trans people, that using the wrong pronouns could actually out people. And this also comes with people you've had previous relationships with, that you perhaps knew prior to them perhaps shifting their pronouns or transitioning. And if you're calling somebody by the wrong pronouns in a space, it could out them and create a dire situation for that person's safety. And then last, just they, them pronouns have been around in English language for a long time to refer to somebody in first person singular, especially when gender, this is before not known, right? But now we can just say is gender is just something that is an inclusive question, right? That is a valid way to experience yourself outside the gender binary.
Amazing, thank you, Leigh. KB?
Yes, and apologies if y'all hear anything in the background. So pronouns, and I want to go kind of off of what Leigh, was talking about with pronouns. Pronouns are an extension of someone's personhood. So you wouldn't want me to be just continuously giving you the incorrect name, like Marissa has told me that her name is Marissa. I would not just be out here calling her Emily, you know, just because I don't agree with the name Marissa. It's the same thing, you know what I mean? Like, it's not something that you agree or disagree with. It is just a person's personhood. And if you are not respecting that, that person is not going to want to be around you. That person is not going to feel safe around you. And so much of what we're going to be talking about today is safety and the constant kind of like unsafety of trans people at the expense of cis people who just feel uncomfortable with their personhood being different than a trans person's personhood. It's an issue. And if you see pronouns less as like some kind of like accessory thing and more of like a core part of someone's personhood that is and can change just like names can change, right? Like, I think we would be better off. And like the pushback that I generally have when someone is having a hard time with pronouns, especially they, them pronouns, that seems to be like those and other neo pronouns seem to be the issues that most people have with getting someone's pronouns right. Not the only, but definitely a lot. They is singular and has been since 12th century, like Chaucerian era usage of English. I know that I have a writing degree, so I'm just like, know so much about the colonizer English language. Like if I was to, for instance, we were all in a room and I leave a pen down, but you don't know that I did that, right? You don't know who left a pen at the table. You would say, somebody left their pen, I hope they come back and get it. And you would not think twice about it because we use they in a singular way already, and we have for so many centuries, right? So that is generally my pushback that I would suggest that you use. They is singular and has been in English for a very long time, and you use it presently for objects. And when you don't know what a person looks like, just because now you know what they look like, you are having an issue with that. And that's something to think about internally, right? And also, I think it's important to bring up, like, if you don't understand, there's so many, like Google is free, you know what I mean? Like there's so many videos, infographics. My gosh, you know, I see them on my timeline all the time explaining what pronouns are. That information is very much accessible. One resource that I often use is like, I think it's called mypronouns.org. Don't quote me on that, but it has like maybe a paragraph of information for every single kind of usage of pronouns that you could think of. And I use that, you know, to be like, if you want to learn this, take 2 minutes out of your day and maybe watch this clip or read this, right? And I think that it doesn't just stop at pronouns, right? Which we're going to talk about other things. But I want to super emphasize that, like, seeing the person as that gender, meaning getting their pronouns right, and also not being inquisitive about who they were before social or medical transition, and also not making assumptions about that person based on their pronouns or based on knowing that they're trans, right? Trans people are not a monolith. And it's important to see that person, as a gender that they would like you to see them as. And that goes past using pronouns. So yeah.
Thank you. You guys all gave incredible answers. So one more on pronouns, and this is another where I'll ask each of you to speak, but I promise I won't do this for every question. One thing, I guess for some context, is here at Daily Kos, we are like a remote company. Like some of us see each other in person outside of COVID, but generally we're mostly communicating on Slack. And some of us communicate a lot with readers on our website, like through comments and social media. So there's like a dialogue, and it's common that our readers will engage on articles or videos we produce. So with that in mind, I would love to hear from you all on what could be a good starting point, or what could be a good foundation for how people can take accountability, or like appropriately apologize if or when we do make mistakes. Like if someone does misgender someone, get their pronouns wrong, maybe once, maybe more than once, like what is maybe a good baseline check-in for how to take accountability and address that, especially if you can think about it just in terms of Slack or like a Zoom call, because that's usually what we're doing here. I'll let whoever wants to jump in first go.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I think that this is going to be specific to the individual, because I don't think that what I would like someone to do in that instance is maybe going to be the same as what Holiday or Leigh would like someone to do in that instance, because we're all like individual people. And it's important that like when harm is done to a person, that like you center the harmed party's like needs in that instance. But I can tell you what I would like, which is I am generally not a fan of over apologizing. You know what I mean? Like it happens and you're like, I'm so sorry. And, let me tell you this story about why I didn't use their pronouns correctly. And also let me apologize again in 10 minutes just to bring up the fact that I did it again. And let me say all of these demeaning things about myself. Like, I don't like that. I don't like that because also it feels less about me, like less about you messing up my pronouns and more about you trying to deal with your guilt. You don't always have to like auditorily process your guilt about something when you do something wrong. Or if you process that, I don't think I need to be there for it personally. So probably no to over apologizing. I personally enjoy oh, sorry, I'm gonna do better next time. And we move on with whatever conversation that we're having. And the do better next time to me looks like getting my pronouns right. You know what I mean? So like just not making that moment about yourself, right? I think is a key that probably is pretty universal. But I personally like when people just kind of move on, not make it an event, not make it a I'm sorry tour situation.
Thanks for that, KB. I feel similarly on a lot of those points. I think specifically for written platforms, I appreciate when people both directions. I've gotten feedback that people appreciate if I go in I'm trying to think of the name of it, like a private chat to say, hey, just a heads up, so-and-so's pronouns are actually what have you, versus responding in the big public chat, because I feel like it just draws more attention there in a way that the person who was mispronounced might not have consented to. One thing I'll add is yes to not over apologizing and taking care. The fragility of the person making the mistake is not the responsibility of the person who was mispronounced. But I do appreciate an acknowledgement, not just acting like it didn't happen, I don't appreciate, I appreciate if it's like, if someone does say something, oh, my bad. Or if I say something that they, acknowledge it and leave it there, and then handle whatever feelings come up somewhere else with someone else. So then the one-on-one corrections versus in the large group for written things. And then I also just, I mentioned earlier about that everyone makes mistakes, and that to that point, like practice. I think practicing when you're not with that if someone, especially if you're not someone that has a lot of people in your life who are changing pronouns, like you don't have a lot to you got like one or two people to practice, I just think about, like if for trans and queer, for the non-binary trans queer people, like we're always in the practice. It's not, oh, that's another point actually, it's like we're all practicing, right? It's not just this didactic, like one-to-one, there's a person transitioning and then everyone else needs to get their pronoun. Like we also have other trans people in our lives who we're in a relationship with, that we're evolving with and transforming with, including their names and pronouns and other things. So that's one thing. But also back to the practice point, especially if it's new for you, or if you just have a few people, or even if you have more people, just sort of like envisioning talking about them when outside of the moment, when they're not around, and really practicing that. I know for my family, some of my family that really loves me and is just like struggling on the cognitive shift part, they're like, oh, when I practice I get it better. So yeah, I think that's all I'll say about that.
Yeah, the whole like practicing thing, I just have to like be real. Like I've had times with colleagues of mine who've used pronouns that are ones that for some reason I'm just messing up, right? I have a dear colleague that I worked with weekly, and I just had to put a post-it note up on my behind my monitor that says Danny uses they them pronouns, and just be done with it, right? So that was my attempt to practice, to make sure that I'm actually doing the work, because you can mess up once and say like, oh, sorry, and then if you realize that that's a pattern that's going on, it's like, I need to do something different than just say sorry and move on. I need to actually take the effort that's there to make sure that that relationship is not going to be further damaged. And that's something that we don't often think about, is like, if we actually care about building relationships with people, if we're trying to connect to people, then we actually are going to have to care about how they receive us as well, right? And so I can't just be like, they'll just get over it, whatever. Instead, like, ooh, I'm creating an inauthentic relationship or a challenge or a barrier between us, and that's going to make harder to, I don't know, be friendly, just do work, trust that they're going to have my back when stuff goes down and we need to run with some big issue or something. Like all of those things that happen just are going to make it more difficult for that person to connect. For your readers, for your contributors who you don't ever see in person, maybe never even see a picture of, you really have to acknowledge that, like, if you want them to connect to KOS and the work that you're doing, you can't start off by saying, it's not a big issue to me, so it's going to be not a big issue for them. Because like Holiday said before, right, it may not be a big issue to the other person, but it's a big issue for the person who receives the wrong pronouns. Also, the plant thing is perfect. We have a cat that we gave they them pronouns to, not just for us to practice, but that way everybody else around us had more of a possibility that when they were talking about our cat, they were going to use they them pronouns, and to make sure that our kid also had more practice in using their pronouns, right? And so it was because our cat doesn't know gender, our cat doesn't know anything. Like our cat knows how to eat food and chase and suck on their tail and all sorts of stuff, right? But gender is a human creation. That cat doesn't need to have he, him, or she, her pronouns. They, them pronouns work fine. They still get fed. They still get their pets. So definitely a way to continue to practice. And I also agree, like the casual, at least, response of not making it about you. The apology is for the harmed person. It's not for the person making the apology to absolve themselves of guilt. So always just know what you're centering when you're having that conversation.
Leigh just reminded me about something in media that if I've seen two ways, and I think the important thing is to check in with the person who you're writing about. If someone is mispronounced in a story, I've seen where like the editor will come and do a postscript and be like, there was a mistake, or just to update this. but then the original article is still all wrong pronouns, or just go and change them completely and not put a postscript. So for some reason, Leigh reminded me of that in terms of media and writing.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that because I've been like misnamed in like kind of like media posts before. And I don't know. I was not super a fan of like this person's name was this in an earlier version of this, but now it's this. I'm like, don't do that. Just say you updated the name. Why you want to like dead name me again, you know, in the like even like update. So just emphasizing what Holiday was saying, like check in with the person before maybe making that executive decision if a mess up happens.
Absolutely. Thank all of you. Those were wonderful answers. And I'm excited to see that many people in the chat are also a fan of the cat and plant idea. So thank you. Okay, so for our next section, I would love to move into gender affirming healthcare and with an overlap for breaking down misconceptions and right-wing talking points. And so gender affirming healthcare in terms of adult need and also youth need, just to give everyone an idea of where we're going. So to start us off, and I will again open this up to whichever of our panelists would like to start, because I know these questions are going to be a little more involved. So please take time to, think through and consider. You don't need to rush to respond right away. But I would love to hear what you think is the biggest misconception allies, like people who are maybe Democrats or vote blue or even donate blue. So not necessarily far right people, but people we would hope are on our side. What are some of the biggest misconceptions these allies have about trans youth seeking gender affirming care? Like what you think some of the struggles people have are, like where those misconceptions come from?
Yeah, this is my kind of jam, so I will start. So misconception, because I live in Texas, misconception, like USA. But I think a large misconception is around gender affirming care in youth is that youth can make these kind of like body altering decisions at a super young age. You actually, depending on your state, but I would say all states actually don't allow you to do any kind of large procedure like top surgery, for example, until you're like 16, and before you're 18, you have to have parental consent. So a lot of people think that, a 3-year-old or something can like walk into an office and just get this. Like, no, that is actually misconceptions that, a specific group of people are peddling, right? And also, even for things like hormone replacement therapy, in my particular state, you cannot get that until I believe you are 16, and you have to have parental consent from 16 and 17 until you are 18, right? That's number one, the more obvious one. Number two, I think that we think about gender affirming care in these very limited ways for both adults and youth, where we're like, gender affirming care is only trans stuff, when it's actually like cisgender people also get gender affirming care all of the time. If a cisgender man says that he is tired, he will get prescribed testosterone. You know what I mean? Like they get prescribed testosterone so easy. And also things like plastic surgery, gender affirming care, anything that like you alter. And if you alter your body in any way, because gender is a presentation, you know what I mean? Like that is gender affirming care, right? So this is not a thing that is even specific to trans youth, right? And youth, right? Just like cisgender, you just like trans, you get gender affirming care in different ways, right? And also gender affirming healthcare is not even, to me, just about surgeries and HRT. It is like everyday interactions that trans and non-cis folks have with the healthcare system. I have this article, not to self-plug, but I do have this article about like what it's like to go to the gynecologist when you're Black, trans, and in Texas, and talking about how actually difficult that experience is. You know what I mean? And like gender affirming healthcare to me would mean that anybody, regardless of gender, like their experience of gender, can get the healthcare that they need, and that you don't have to, like, that youth or adult doesn't have to be put in the position to educate their provider, or to like be unsafe also, because like being trans or non-cis in medical situations can also lead to a unsafety, because it's like if you have someone in front of you that has the power to, I don't know, alter your experience of your body or your mind, you know, that is a large, you know, responsibility. And I think it's super important that people are competent around, you know, giving healthcare to trans folks. I kind of like went in a circle, but promise, I'm coming back, which is misconceptions are that this is like a single issue, when we do not live single issue lives. Word to Audre Lorde. This is a thing that absolutely everybody should care about, because having legislation that hinders what you individually can, how you can support your child, is an issue that everyone, you know, should care about, right? And a misconception is that it's a trans issue. I think it's a human rights issue.
Thank you so much for that, KB. I'm just like having memories of my first gynecological visits in Omaha, Nebraska in like early 2000s, and just like sobbing through it because I was hoping to get on hormones and instead just dealing with like a really caustic man and just a really horrible experience, right? Like that, like this is just an underpin that like healthcare for anybody is hard in the United States, right? It's already hard. So like who actively desires to engage more with the healthcare system just for funsies? It's so rare that that happens. People are struggling to actually get any sort of care whatsoever. And so for trans people to take the extra effort to actually seek out trans, like actual like care that is to affirm and support their experience of their identity in the world, like that's not something that just happens on accident. It's great consideration, great deliberation. And while there are people who might, and I'm just like putting on like the absolute far right, you know, kind of statements that they think, like there may be people out there who are doing this as a whim, right? That would be the tiniest little speck of dust in a absolute sandstorm to find that individual. And people do a whole bunch of things around their healthcare on a whim as well. And those things are allowed, right? We can do things to our bodies in a lot of different ways that are legally supported and sanctioned. The reason why this is, it's because people think it's weird. And because of that, we make trans youth be absolutely rock solid in their identity, because you're going to regret it one day. Or what if you're making a mistake? What if this is just on a whim? And you know what? We actually get to do those things. Like just because somebody comes out as trans at 8, 9, 10 years old and actually moves their body in a way that actually aligns more with their gender identity, and that gender identity changes at age 20, 25, 27, like that doesn't mean that was a mistake. It just means that's what they were doing at that time. Just like you might go on a whim and say, I'm going to shave my head and paint my head purple, and that's going to be what I do every day. And then you know what? You stop doing that someday. Because we can do things about our bodies that aren't our forever things. We can move to areas, we can take careers, we can do so many life-changing things. We can say we're not going to college, the hell with college, I don't need it, and then decide 20 years later that you want to do that. These aren't these aren't things that we can't shift and change. They're just part of our experience in the world. And so I think we're just framing it consistently in this wrong space, that it is this like absolutely rock solid, cannot change, cannot be, cannot go into unless people are absolutely certain. And we don't make that demands of other people for other things. This should be just something that's like, okay, maybe I went through some care. Maybe I got a hysterectomy and I can't carry a kid. And there's a lot of people in the world who want to carry kids who've had hysterectomies and find ways to do it. There's so many things that we could do to just say this is just one of the ways to be in the world without making it this monolithic, horrible thing for especially young people to have to beat through.
Yes, yes, to both my colleagues' comments. Totally, totally. I mean, I feel like the only thing that I would add is, and I feel like KB, you were getting to this a little bit, is just that affirming healthcare for trans people is not just about the gender affirming care. It's also, you know, how we're treated at the dentist, at the mental health provider, all the different body parts and inside and out that we maintain and get checked out. That's always a question for a lot of people. As Leigh said, healthcare is a shit show in our country, so it is hard to access affirming and accessible healthcare in this disease management system that we have going here. And so, of course, if you add other oppressed identities to that, but like, you know, I'll use some personal self-disclosure. I determine I'm pretty out pretty much everywhere in life. I determine if I'm gonna out myself as a trans person, if it's a new provider who might not need to know. So like I go to urgent care for like a COVID test. Do I need to out myself to them? I have to, and I'm sharing like, this is a thing that even if it's the most affirming urgent care place, I still have to do that work to figure out if I'm safe to do that, if it's safe to do that, and if I want to do that labor. So it's like, even if we create the best systems, this is still like something trans people have to navigate. So that's important to keep in mind. But back to my story of like getting a COVID test at an urgent care center. I need to figure out, like, let's say, you know, that's still like something that like is needs to even those providers, not just the lower doctors and the endocrinologists and all the doctors that administer trans affirming or excuse me, gender affirming medicine. It's everybody needs more education and competence about being safe places. So that's, I think, the only thing I'll add to those brilliant answers. Yeah.
Can I just hop real quick on the end of that too, Holly, because thank you for opening this up. We're talking about medical providers. It's not just like the doctor. It's the person who you make an appointment with on the phone. It's a person who hands you the form. It's a person who like comes out and calls your legal name in front of everybody as you're going to the room. Like many of you may already know this, like I carried my child. I was at a gynecological office on a regular basis looking like this, pregnant and waiting to see a doctor. I eventually started to get over having the issue. I worked with that provider pretty heavily, and later on ended up training their entire hospital system because of learning all the mistakes. But that experience is something that somebody, every single time they go in, they're going to have to deal with that. And that is not just an experience of what the actual like healthcare provider who's trained in medicine does. It's what the administrator does, what the billing does. It's what insurance continues to do. All of these things, when we're talking about medical providers, like all have an engagement with our things. And we're not even just saying, we're asking if you're trans or even what your gender is. It's going to ask you, what surgeries are you on? What medication are you taking? And those things will out you if nothing else does. So there's a long system overhaul in healthcare, and it completely aligns up with the other alignments with healthcare we need to do. And we're not naming, like, you know, and Holiday, you mentioned intersectional identities. I want to just name the way that like race and racism and white supremacy show up in the healthcare system. If we want to actually start dismantling some of this stuff, we have to acknowledge all of the ways that these things actually dovetail together, because Black trans people are going to be screwed a hell of a lot more because of the combination of race and gender. And then when you add on trans feminine women of color, we have a whole other thing because of misogyny and cissexism and racism that are all playing together. So if you care about racism, you care about sexism, you got to care about these things too, because there are trans women of color that are struggling, and they're struggling because the systems are all intertwining to actually make it worse for most people, actually.
I want to share a funny story that Leigh just reminded me of. When I was picking up my first testosterone prescription, I live in Atlanta, and there's a certain way that a lot of places in the South that, we speak to each other, we make small talk with complete strangers. So I get where this guy was coming from. The pharmacist was an old Black man, or at least I perceived him to be a man. He was an elder. And he read my prescription, picking up my first tea prescription, and out loud in front of the whole pharmacy, CVS pharmacy, there's a line, there's shoppers. He goes, they got you on this for 3 months, baby girl. I don't know what's going on with you. I'm sorry. But anyway, here you go. And it was just like, wow, come on, HIPAA. What in the name of HIPAA violation? But also, like, outside of the gender moment, I have a million moments like that in the South as a Black person, speaking of intersections. And I otherwise would have loved it if he wouldn't say I loved he was concerned. He was like, oh, why is this person I read to be female on testosterone cypionate for 3 months? And I'm on that too. He probably was, right? So, but like in this, obviously it was, like to Leigh's point of like all the various players within our healthcare system, could use competency and education, but also just those cultural nuances and like, yeah, just it gets tricky.
Yeah, and last thing I want to add, absolutely thank y'all for bringing those things up, because I'm like, oh, the doctors that I just didn't go to because their front office was so atrocious and like just misgendering me in front of everybody, a problem. But like bringing it back to kind of like a journalistic standpoint, when you're covering, these things on like trans youth, I think it's super important to get all of those players to be represented in those stories, because this attack against trans youth and the whole like medicalization of it all, because trans youth don't have just issues with like transness as their like only kind of like medical thing. There are so many things in the medical system that hinder just regular old folk, like cisgender folks, right? That also like harm trans folks, like pricing. Like a lot of my friends did not get top surgery for a super long time because they could not afford it, things like that. And also to be covering things like that, I think is super important. And also insurance companies doing this whole pathologizing of transness and being like, you have to be on testosterone for a certain amount of time. How long have you been? Literally, I'm thinking about this because I just like forwarded an email for one of my friends thinking about getting top surgery. And I looked at the old email and they were like, how long have you been living as a man? Like had all of these qualifying questions, in order to get the medical care that I needed to get. All of it needs to be pushed back on, in my state. Also, in order to get a legal name change, you have to, have been on it. You have to get what do you call it? A letter of support from an MD or a PhD to say this person has gender identity disorder. It's just like, why should I need to do that? Why should I need to do that? Right? Why is so much of transness being like, you have to tell people that something is wrong with you in order for you to affirm your gender, right? We should just change all that. And, those issues are for youth and adults, like changing the way that we think about transness, changing the competency level, making it much higher for the care that we give trans people.
Thank you all. That was excellent. I love that you all are like responding back and forth to each other. It feels much more organic, and I am definitely enjoying listening. So actually, off of what KB was just saying, and I'll open this to anyone, I would love to get feedback from you all. A topic I cover on the site and that has gotten some national coverage for sure, but that I feel for a number of reasons, I'm sure, is not getting the same outcry as other issues, is Republicans have pushed a number of obviously anti-trans legislation to try to make it essentially impossible for trans youth or trans adults to update their birth certificates, like to update their sex and name on their birth certificate. And I've noticed readers on our site don't always respond very poignantly to the issue, but in terms of education, I would love if any of you could speak to why, on like a practical level, like why having accurate like legal documentation and why like having it be accessible to get that is so important for anyone, but especially trans people.
Nobody jump into it. I can jump to it. The birth certificate piece feels like an intersection of a few things. It feels like access to records, human rights / civil rights, reproductive rights, and trans rights issues. All of those issues, rather. And just for clarity, I think the issue is not so much that every trans person wants to change their birth certificate. It's that for those who need to or want to, there should be that access under the guise of it being our personal records. So, you know, birth and death is a legal contract. And so you can't just have a baby be born and not file that birth with the state, right? Or the other way if someone passes away. And so with that legal contract, as a baby, you know, there's no autonomy there. It defaults to whoever the guardians are, parents or the state or what have you. The idea though is with aging and self-determination, and being, you know, barring other things that might make you not like a full-fledged citizen, which I'd probably have issues with about those things too, about criminalization and all that, but you know, you're not on papers or what have you. And the idea is like other documents you can change so all the time, and this one should be no different. And the necessity of it is life and death for some trans people. It is a matter of being able to continue whatever a particular journey of affirming one's gender and just full self is. Sometimes people need this to connect with other legal document, either marriage, Social Security, other things. There's a real necessity of really being able to change that document is a green light for access to other documents. There's also the case of people who actually don't want to change it, but need to change it to protect themselves. I'm of that. That is my personal story. I don't interact with my birth certificate enough to feel like incongruent with it. Like, I don't really care what it says. The problem is with a transphobic parent that is also an insurance agent. My father has multiple life insurance policies that he owns for me. And because he is transphobic and also a narcissist, I need to legally I need to have some boundaries from him physically, but also legally, I need him not to be able to make decisions about me in the case of my death, or even just to have money that he can do things with in the case of my death. He won't, I'm not going to get too much in the weeds about this personal story, but all to say that like he won't relinquish these multiple birth certificate policies. And the only way they can come null and void is if that person who the policy is for no longer exists. In other words, you know, and so like otherwise, you know, in the case of my death, they're gonna, this person, these identity, this person's birth certificate, this person's death certificate, this life insurance policy, boom, right? So that's like actually one of my loopholes to get to create safety for myself. So, and I'm sure there's a million other stories like that where people actually just need to do this, whether they want to or not. And so why is the state, you know, well, we know why, but anyway, that's what I got on that.
Yeah, thank you, Holiday, for that answer. I'm thinking about legal documentation and why being accessible, like having that be accessible and being able to change that is so important. And it's like, where in the world do you go where you don't need an ID to get any medical or governmental thing done, really? Like, where can you get a job without an ID in this country? Where can you go to even have a drink, right? At a bar? It's literally what you need to access most services and buildings in the US. And I personally am not a fan of having to out myself every time I have to do that. You know, that puts me in like safety risk. For someone to look at my ID, you know, I still haven't gotten my ID updated actually, but I need to, because people will look at my ID and then just like act totally different for the rest of our interaction. You know what I mean? Just based on that information that they have about me, where I'm like, I don't even have consent to give this information. Like, I had to give you this information in order to get access to whatever the service is. And that's not fair. Like, cisgender people don't have to go through these kind of like weird, you know, and possibly unsafe. So far it has been weird, and I'm one of the lucky ones, but it can be very unsafe, these interactions. And honestly, like with birth certificates, I think that because of safety and because of transphobia that is kind of cooked into our culture, some folks have to be stealth, you know. And if you don't know what that means, it means like a trans person that is not, you know, telling anyone that they are trans under any circumstances, really, right? And some folks have to live that kind of life, which is unfortunate. But for that reason, they have to have an updated birth certificate, right? And that means that, you know, for anything like marriage, for anything like passports, like you very much need a birth certificate for all of those things. I actually just got a passport, and it's such an issue, right? So where like, you know, trans folks have to have these whisper networks for like what clerks they can go to in order to get married, or what place they can go to in order to request a legal name change, or like, you know, like it shouldn't take all that, but unfortunately that is just the world that we live in, right? And getting a marriage certificate even done is very much a thing that is still up to the individual clerk to like choose. Like I think that it was so jarring to me. I was watching Pose recently. I promise this is on topic. I was watching Pose recently, really amazing show, and these two characters were getting married, and they like went to the like office, the county office, to get a marriage certificate, and the trans person in that scenario was so scared, you know, that someone was going to look at their ID, see this, you know, inaccurate depiction of their gender, and deny them a marriage certificate. That kind of stuff still happens, even though that was a, like, you know, TV show set in the 90s. We are in the 2020s, and that is still very much happening. You know what I mean? And it's not illegal to do so because of you know, the ways in which religion and like that clause in the Constitution has been warped, right? Like people can still make these kind of decisions that are not in the best interest of trans people. So for that reason, and also for reasons of like, I don't know anybody that got married that is cisgender that had all of these issues that I'm having with trying to get my name changed. You know what I mean? It's just not equity. It's not equality. You know what I mean? I shouldn't have to go through all of these kind of hoops when, you know, cisgender folks just don't have to do that, and they shouldn't have to do that, and I shouldn't have to do that, right? Legal documentation is just simply how we interact with the world, and we should be able to change that.
I live in New York now, but I was originally from Omaha, Nebraska. It's where I originally came out. And it's where I go back to go and see my family on a regular basis. And before I had my license changed, had gone back to visit, and I stopped. It was late at night, and I was trying to figure out if I was going to go and meet a friend or I was going to go home. And there was nobody else on the street, and the light turned green, and I just sat there for a moment, and then the light turned red again. And the cop apparently saw me just sitting there, not going through a green light, and blooped their lights and came up to me. And upon looking at, and all I did was just not go through the light, like nothing else. And they said, well, can you look at my license, hand it back to me, and said, pull over in this parking lot. And 8 squad cars came. 8. While they had me out and did every single stand on the line, do all the drunk tests, anything they could possibly do. And it was a parade. It wasn't anything else. It was a parade. And at the end, they ended up taking me home, and that was the end of it. Like taking me, like letting me get in my car and go home, and that was the end of it. If my license looked any other way, I wouldn't have that issue. But because they looked at how I looked incongruent with what the F on my license, that became a reason for them to call up all of their friends in the middle of the night by myself, just standing there in a parking lot, dancing for, you know, teens of police officers. And as KB said, like, these aren't hoops that other people have to go through to make that happen, right? I worked for a trucking company. I had a client, employee that worked there who had changed his name from like Mark Sanders to Lonesome Dove because he liked the movie a lot. And that was fine. That was just granted. You can be Lonesome Dove, no issue. But when someone's like, okay, I'd like to go from, you know, Ashley to Ash, people are like, whoa, you must be skating some like credit card fraud or something like that. And that's why we're doing it. This, you know, these laws, I mean, particularly when it comes to a birth certificate, the question is also like, is it actually helpful to have a record of what someone's genitals look like when they came out of the womb? Because that's what it says, right? It's like, what does your genitals look like? And based on a cursory look of genitals, we stamp on this particular marker. Now, if I can go in front of the cops and be like, whoa, we don't understand what's going on here. The only thing they look, if they're like trying to find me in the world, the only thing they have a record of how I look like is what my genitals look like when I was an infant. They have nothing else about how they can actually record who I am as a human being. And they're probably, when they're looking for somebody who has genitals that look like how I was born as an infant, are not looking for a face that looks like this. So it's not even a helpful identifying tool because we look so different than we did when we were babies and can always look different from that. So that isn't actually a helpful tool anyway. So why it's even there is already an antiquated thing. It comes from these ideas of who you are and who you're supposed to be based on how your body's shaped. And if we think that bodies equal behaviors, then we're fine. But we know that that's not actually true. And so the document actually loses its meaning when you actually see how it shows up in practice, how it's actually used. And so then why are we actually holding on to it? And at the same time, like, I also don't have my birth certificate changed. It was too high of a bar at the time. My birth certificate's in Omaha, Nebraska. I didn't want to deal with it. And it's not a big issue. I'm super, super out, but it can still be an issue. It has been a thing that can flag people, and it's not as much an issue anymore, but it's flagged people in terms of like credit searches when they're doing a job, when they're looking for a job for no match things. And while it's not as much an issue anymore, some will still get flagged. It will out people and it will cause them to lose their employment. Because, not if anything, first off, the idea that perhaps they are trying to defraud the company that they're being hired for, that's one. The other is that there are so many clauses in contracts that this job offer is contingent on that you provided accurate and honest information to your employer. And if there's some piece of information that they think is not accurate or honest, they can terminate your contract immediately. And all you need to do is get some sort of notification that your some sort of legal documentation doesn't match up. And so if you end up having that causes you lack of employment. And unemployment numbers for trans people are double the national average, and for trans people of color, it's 4 times the national average. Right? And unemployment is because of these employment gaps that are caused by the barriers of legal documentation creates, and then all the other barriers to actually working as an employee in the world as a trans person. So for these reasons, yeah, it's not only a crucial document, a life-saving document for a lot of people. We also just have to start asking why, or is it something that we actually still need to be recording? As a person who had a baby just before they changed and allowed for babies to get non-gendered. In fact, I coached in New York State. You can get an X on your birth certificate, can be put on your birth certificate now. And that was something that was coached in by a labor and delivery nurse. That was my labor and delivery nurse, but the person that became the advocate within the hotel system to actually then, for another family, ended up working with, we ended up working together to actually find a loophole to get the first no gender reported in New York State before it was actually a legal thing. And so these are things that like we individuals are trying to do, but it's just proof again that it doesn't actually matter. And if it doesn't matter, then why are we holding on to it so much?
Okay, that was excellent. Thank you. all of you. So the next subject I would love for us to move into is a big one on our site with our readers. I think national media too, but even in our site, our progressives, our Democrat voters, our very loyal reader base. When I cover this subject, I will get hundreds and hundreds of comments of people arguing compared to maybe 15 comments on like a different article, for example. So this really gets people riled up, I'll say. So it is trans folks participating in sports. And this is one where I have gotten some questions from staff already. And I've written a few variations of questions just to maybe guide or push the discussion in different directions. But I guess for framing for you all, I think when we're asking these questions, it's to educate staff and also to help staff who are communicating with our readers, like some foundations or tips or advice on how to combat like incorrect information coming from readers. So it's like educating us, and then eventually that education like pushing through to the greater like progressive readership on our site. Okay, so with that in mind, one starting question that anyone is welcome to jump into is, what would you say to allies who are convinced that allowing trans girls and or trans women, depending on if you want to focus on youth or adult sports, either is fine for now. What would you say to people who feel that allowing trans girls to compete on girls' teams is unfair to cisgender players?
If it's okay, I'd love to jump at the beginning of this, because first off, like, not a sports person, and I know there are other sporty people probably in this panel, and I am not one of them. But I want to say something that like underpins, I think, a lot of this, and just gets to this like other like deeper, kind of some of the deeper pieces that trans people are really struggling with, and hinges on the last thing that we were just talking about. Is that one of the common tropes around trans people is that we are deceivers, and that we are hiding as a thing. Right? Like we are hiding, we have something to, we're being sneaky, that we're being deceptive, and that we are by nature untrustworthy. This comes with common like language structures of saying that, you know, the trans people, like that they were pretending to be, or they were actually, or even the conversation of real, right? Like the concept of like who's real and who isn't. Like all of these things, this undercurrent of being a deceiver is something that tracks into, you know, documentation, right? Definitely, and name changing, but definitely when it comes to sports, because there's this idea that people will be are identifying as trans in order to succeed at some sport and pull some like sneaky caper. You know, that they're pulling the wool over people's eyes, and they're gonna like succeed in running in a women's, you know, marathon, but they really should be running in a men's marathon. Like that as an experience of like why a trans person is going to come out as trans and go through all of the challenges we've already been talking about to make it as a success in one particular thing doesn't happen. And then there's this like little Cold War thing around, you know, the Olympics, and this idea that like, you know, people from the Soviet Union are going to be trying to compete as women in order to get more medals. And it's like, and also, who the hell cares? It's a couple of medals. It's not that big a deal, but we have to do it because the Olympics is war, right? So this idea that like that trans people are deceivers, like that's like one of those common tropes that we're gonna be struggling with, and you're gonna see it continuing to pop up, but it's definitely a core component of why people freak out about the idea of trans people in sports. And then I'll leave it to other sporty people to get more specific on the actual team.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me. People don't cover. I have a couple things to say. So when people like don't cover, like, I don't know, trans women competing alongside cis women in sports, and they like don't win, it's like a non-event, right? When they win, it is a whole thing. And I'm just like, interesting that like when you when they win, it has to be chalked up to, I don't know, their genetic advantage, right? Number one, please show me the research on that. I personally have not seen any research that says like even like substantiates this claim. And if it is research out there, it has been usually from someone that is just transphobic. To this day, and I've looked at like 50 plus, articles trying to find something that substantiates this claim. I have not been able to find it. And then also this whole idea of, well, we shouldn't let some people that have a genetic advantage over others like compete with them. Everyone has a genetic advantage over someone else in some kind of way. So that's a silly argument. Literally based on my genetics, and I just talked to a nurse about this 3 days ago. My Achilles tendons, terrible, because I got bad genetics from both like my mom's side and my dad's side on that, which means that in order for me to be some kind of track star, I would have to train for hours and hours and hours. And that's just to get as good as somebody with like 2 good genes in that, right? Like some folks have longer legs, so they're going to be able to go longer distances than others with shorter legs. Like, are we gonna for real become a society that classifies people based on height and then also based on like other genetic dispositions? No, we are not. Y'all are just being transphobic. You know what I mean? Because everyone in some form or fashion has a genetic advantage over another person in some kind of way. We have so many genes inside of us, right? So like, I don't know. I'm just like, all of the arguments that I've heard so far like sound very silly to me and very non-substantial. And also I feel like I want to amplify what Leigh said, like, and I think we said this earlier as well, like no one is going out of their way to be trans. Like this is not something that someone would choose. We've talked so much about like the disadvantages, right? We've talked so much about like the things that we've had to experience just to be who we are, right? Someone would like choose oppression in order to have some kind of, I don't know, athletic advancement. But the athletic advancement in question is not based on transness. It's based on the fact, have you considered that she was just better than you? Have you considered that? You know what I mean? Like people train and get good at things. Have you considered that? Right? Like, it's just so infuriating to me that this is even a conversation, because like sports by design are competitive, meaning that some people are going to be better than others. Like that literally is just cooked into sports. Right? Are we going to say now that LeBron has some kind of genetic advantage over all of his teammates, so therefore he should not be in the starting four, like in starting five? Are we going to start doing stuff like that? Right? Like because someone's metabolism is higher than another's, which is literally just like science, that like not something that we can like work on, right? I mean, you can't work on your metabolism. That was a bad example, but you know what I mean? Like there are some things that literally are just like human nature. So I don't know. That is my 2 cents. I think it's just like you can come from it from like a research standpoint, and then also from a like genetics. You actually don't know what you're talking about. There are a lot of things that go on with genetics that have nothing to do with your chromosomal makeup. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks, y'all. Yeah, this is a near and dear issue for me because consider myself a radical jock. I've been a lifelong soccer player. I still play, and I was a trans athlete. I am still a trans athlete. I play in a league that's really like super inclusive, and it's like setting the stage for other Atlanta sports leagues to be to just like have great policies and be a safe place for people. And athletics are such an important way for people to build character and build leadership. And so there's so many ways I have so many feelings about this. I'm gonna just try to choose 4. But I have like a whole like list of why this is bogus. First of all, it's actually not even about protecting cis women. It's a prop. It's actually about the discomfort of that our society has around gender, and then our perceptions of gender transgression, and particularly our perceptions when male assigned people transgress their assignments, much more so than if people who are assigned female at birth, just going to use that term for now, there's a lot, the world has much more space for, there's this archetype of tomboys and like, but there's no sort of like counterpart for little boys who are feminine. There's only slurs, right? So we're hyper fixed, our society and culture is hyper fixated on people who are assigned male transgressing that in some way. And that's the whole joke of like the men in the dress joke that is such an old tired trope in so many comedy troupes and comedy scenes, and even like State Farm recently had some fucked up about like before it was like Jake from State Farm, where that character that you see, look cute Jake, it was like some guy, whatever, I don't need to say the joke, I don't need to give it air, but all to say this is a long tired trope, and in this policy it pulls from that discomfort in our Western colonial ideas of gender binary, that there's only two genders and that one is over the other, right? That there's two, and that male and that men are over women. This is the construct that Europe has given us. And so it's not even, it's a prop, similar to like abortion is not, anti-choice people. It's not really about protecting the sanctity of life. It's about controlling people who our society says should not have control of their own bodies. So that's the one thing, is like, it's not actually about that. Two is like, there's no such thing as playing down. People only play up. So if you're a 10-year-old and you're good enough, you can play with older kids. You can play, if you're U10, but you're really good, you can play U12. If you, there's never been a case. So like Leigh was saying, like if someone is in the wild universe that someone's like, I'm going to act like I'm trans just to be better at other people in this sport, that doesn't happen on gender. It also just doesn't happen in sports, period. People don't join sports teams and leagues that are worse than their capacity just to be the best ones. That's just not how athletics work. And another thing, so the last two things that I'll share about giving less breadth to the bogusness of what the proponents of these policies say, but giving more life to the importance of extracurricular activities for youth and for trans youth, and how sports can be a particular one, but any extracurricular activity, but particularly sports. Think of, these are babies who need a safe place to go after school. When does sports happen? After school. Who needs safety? All youth. Who really needs safety? Trans youth. Who really, really needs safety? Trans feminine youth, especially after school. And okay, so you're telling young trans girls who maybe finally have found an activity that they excel in, and that they've presumably it's a safe team, safe coach, etc. Now we're saying, because you perform too well, now you got to find something else to do after school. Just like really think of it on an individual level outside of the policy, right? Just think of that person who is, even if she ain't good, right? That's the other thing. This targets the ones who are like my colleague KB said, oh, only when they win, now y'all mad, right? But what if you're just trying? What if you just want to try volleyball? What if you're actually not, now you can't go because somebody's gonna report you to the dean or to the principal? Like, this is just asinine, just absolutely asinine. Last point I want to make is the anti-Blackness that is embedded in this. Black female assigned, athletes have been targeted for their masculinity and have been for time immemorial. I can cite Caster Semenya, the South African sprinter, who is still under scrutiny, who there was the Olympics just recently had a new ruling. She has to take some sort of hormone blockers or take estrogen, something. They're making, if she wants to continue to compete, they are making her take some hormone. Now, ain't that something? the trans kids who want to take hormone blockers, they say no. And then you make somebody who don't want them to. It's just all a hot mess. Let me finish this point though about the anti-Blackness. Thank you, somebody who mentioned Simone Biles. The scrutiny of Black athletes, of Black people, period, as objects of work and entertainment is a thing that I think y'all all know. And then also the scrutiny that Serena Williams gets. I mean, the list goes on and on. So there is a particular, I think that this is also a Black issue. I think even, you know, cis, straight Black folks should care about this issue also. And it's also a public safety issue also, just in terms of like, these are youth who have found a safe place to go, you know, and now you're telling them they need to find somewhere else. So yeah, it's a hot mess.
Yes, affirming every single thing that you just said. So glad we have a sporty person on the panel, because I was like, ooh, I can't talk to the specifics. I tried to play basketball, but I was not good. So glad you're here. And I just want to say, like, also, there is no like definite like amount of testosterone or definite amount of estrogen in any given person. Like, some cisgender men have higher levels of estrogen, some cisgender women have higher levels of testosterone. That should not be a cause for concern, just like you know, thinking about trans folks in sports. Like, okay, testosterone and estrogen to me feel very not important as far as sports are concerned, because it's a lot about training and it's a lot about genetics. And the only way that you even kind of make up for maybe like a recessive trait in your genetics is by training. So these girls are just good. And I'm gonna leave it at that.
You know, you just reminded me of something, KB. I'll throw down on this one more time. Is yes to those hormones. I mean, we all have all these hormones, and like most of the people with testosterone prescriptions are aging cis men, and that's just a fun fact for like a lot of, we all transitioning, we all are like, you know, throughout life. And so just to demystify like the trans experience and to detokenize us, it's like there's all the bodies are changing, you know, from birth to death and transitioning. But a personal story is when I was earlier on in my medical transition, I was like not seeing some of the physical changes that I wanted. And I asked my doctor, should I get a higher dose? And he was like, no, I go to like a queer medical place. He's like, I got big burly bears. I don't know if y'all know what bears are, but just big burly bears who have low testosterone rates and little skinny twinks with testosterone off the roof. He's like, it's really not correlated. And also maybe let's interrogate like why do you want certain images? We cool. So he can ask me this, like, what is it that you want and why is that? Where does that come from? So I'm like, get out of my life. But anyway, so absolutely about, you know, who's on these hormones and their effects, or there's a lot of misconceptions about their effects. The other thing I just want to throw down about the athletic piece in particular is yes, any extracurricular activity is great, especially if it's safe, is great for anybody, especially youth. The thing I really want to throw down on about athletics though is it's because it is such a physical thing. I'd say that the same would be true for like theater or anything where you're really like, it's an embodied practice that is so important for youth and for trans people. Like especially people, your bodies are changing to have an outlet where you can like really be embodied and be out of your head and not think about like, am I doing this right because of my, you know, what they say I am or what they say I'm not, and just really get to like the team aspect and the passing and the shooting and that is just so, that's such character, that's such a playing ground, no pun intended, for playing field for character development and like soothing your nervous system, and like there's just so much to be had there in and of itself. And so the idea of taking that away is just, it hurts my little jock heart.
all. Those were excellent answers. So before we move into the Q&A portion, I do want to press down with just one more question on trans sports, because it's for context, this is a line of argument that I know as a writer I get often in comments, and I know some folks who do site moderation and like community work with our readers. I know they come up against this like line of attack very often. So I would just love to hear what you all like, what kind of response you would suggest. But often when it comes to trans youth in sports, and sometimes trans adults too, especially like the NCAA stuff, but a very common response that I see is people who do consider themselves allies, again, right, Democrats, progressives, they'll say, or how to put it, they get very much into the weeds, and they'll be like, okay, but what if that fifth grader, what if their bone structure has already developed and they haven't started hormones? Or what about this, you know, this high schooler who has like there's a, I think like a deep urge, I think regurgitated from right-wing talking points, whether they realize it or not, to be very like, but what about like the science, or but what about this specific example, or what about that? So I guess I would love to hear from you all, like what your kind of gut reactions or what advice you would give people to kind of redirect the conversation, or to kind of like call those things out as just talking points. Anything along those lines I think could be really helpful in trying to educate our readers without I guess without like shaming them, but just trying to like reshape this very common rhetoric that we're seeing on our site.
Yeah, my initial reaction is like, whataboutism just doesn't really have a place in intellectual conversation. And I know that's not like nice or whatever, but like, if you're getting not nice comments, I don't know what's wrong with a not nice answer. You can be kind without being nice, you know? And also often scenarios about fictitious kids are not backed by research, and also not backed by even personal experience. I'm just like, I maybe would even ask, like, do you have an example of this that has happened in the news? Do you have an example of this that has happened in research? Like, if you don't have an example, it's literally something you made up. And I'm just like not actually sure that that's helpful for a conversation where you are trying to understand. Sometimes with those comments, you know, and I get those when I get published with like larger publications, Huffington Post included. I'm like, so what is your goal with asking me this question? Like, are you trying to learn more? Or are you trying to do this whole, you know, bad faith arguing thing? Because I don't actually have time. If you already have your mind made up about me and about trans people, I can't, and you don't deserve my time, you know, talking about this. Often when I'm trying to like intervene in harmful conversations, I ask questions, I get inquisitive, because that is seen as like less mean, quote unquote. When you ask questions versus saying like, shut down, this is not okay. But I also feel like it's like, I just don't know that me answering this question about a fictitious kid is really going to be helpful to like this dialogue that we're trying to open up. I don't know.
No, I totally agree with you, KB. I think that like a lot of times we can what if any scenario. And for some people, it's a helpful thing for them to start to learn the boundaries of an idea or of an issue, right? And so they're trying to figure out, where does this actually have, where are the edges of this conversation? As a person who receives a lot of those questions, I'm much like KB, I'm just saying like, yeah, I don't have time for this. This is just, you're just getting like all these imaginary scenarios in order to continue to challenge my right to exist and move through the world. As a person who trains on these issues, I approach it a little bit differently at times, right? Which is just to remind people that, you know, to really help understand that folks are often when they're trying to what if, they really are trying to learn what are the extremities of this thing. Some people are literally trying to what if in order to tank the issue, right? And so I'm trying to lean into that allies space of people who actually really want to support and help. And if that's really what you want to do, to help to start to get to like what's at the core of their what if. Like, are you actually really trying to understand this issue more? Because what we're going to say is like, we can come up with a scenario. Anybody could actually pretend to be somebody else in order to defraud a sports team. Anybody can pretend to be somebody else in order to, I don't know, in order to do harm, or because they have a whim, or because they're just, you know, they have an issue and they really hate all girls in sports, and so they really want to screw them over, right? Like, there are so any possibilities. Those are possible. They're not likely. We don't have experience of them actually happening. And so while those may be something that's happening, let's actually, instead of focusing on the one maybe, all of the thousands and thousands of trans young people who are trying to engage in sports and need to do so in a safe and supportive way. For all the reasons that my colleagues have already identified. So just from helping really support people, it's like, this is the pathway to actually get to the place that we want to go. Let's definitely, yes, they're right. Those are all possible. It's not likely, it's not happening in any of our experiences. It's the same conversation on the bathroom thing, right? Like, what if someone's going to dress up like a woman and go and molest people? Cool. Hasn't happened in any situation. In fact, men don't dress up like women when they want to accost women, almost ever. It's consistently just like, and because sexual assault is already illegal. So they just do it, they're gonna do it. And so we have to always remember that, like, the conversation, like the what ifs, there's always what ifs, but there's actual people who aren't experiencing those what ifs, and they're the people we need to support.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add to that question. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Thank you all. I very much appreciate my colleagues typing up your answers as well. I honestly was surprised myself that this issue in particular is such a sticking point with our readers, but it is. And so this is truly deeply helpful to kind of arm so many of us who work with like our community directly to kind of have like some good starting points on how to handle these conversations that can go so far down like a tunnel of whataboutism. So that's very helpful. So I think we're just about at 2:15, which is incredible timing. And so I believe now we're going to move into our Q&A section. I know we have a few questions. The first one, or actually, does anyone need like a 2-minute break, or are we good going into Q&A? How do people feel?